So first of all, a bit about what widget actually means in the context we're talking about it, because lots of different things are referred to as widgets. And there's not really a sort of hardcore definition of what one is. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about for the purposes of this session. A widget is basically a small one-stop program or applet or app, which basically does one job. It could be, well, mainly they're there for presenting data to the user alongside other widgets. So you might find they're doing things like monitoring network traffic, server load, CPU temperature. They could be showing you your Twitter feed. They could be showing you how many emails you've got. But you wouldn't find them doing something like having a full-blown email client within a widget. It would be more like showing you what's in your inbox or something like that, which then might link you to, you know, a more fully fledged application behind the scenes. Depending on where they're running, depends on the technologies they use, because obviously if you're running on a desktop computer, you might have different technologies available to if you're running on a mobile phone. And usually when we think of a widget, we think of something which is quite small graphically speaking. So it's running in restricted screen space. That could be that it's running on a big screen but only taking up a little part of it, or it could be it's running on a small screen like a mobile phone, touch screen, something like that. And just about some of the environments where they might run. Because of the nature of widgets being small applications, there's lots of different places that you might see them. First one is on a desktop computer. If you run KDE on Linux, or if you run Apple computers, then you'll have seen widgets on things like the dashboard, where you can have things that do all sorts of things, from anything from a calculator. I've seen one which shows you facts about Jack Bauer that people have made up. I've seen you know, currency converters, world clocks, maps, all sorts of little things like that. And yeah, they're designed to display sort of several on the screen at once, rather than having a full screen application open. A lot of phones are moving towards the widget sort of architecture for their applications. BlackBerry have just released something called WebWorks, which is using the W3C standard for widgets to run web widgets on their mobile phone as applications. WebOS, which was originally created by Palm and is now created by HP, doesn't use the same standards, but it does use the same technologies. It's still JavaScript, HTML for running the applications that run on WebOS. Android is sort of getting there. It runs sort of widgets on its desktop. It doesn't use the same technologies at the moment. It uses its own Java API for that. And there's other phones which do similar sort of things. Apple don't seem as enthusiastic with widgets on their phones as they do on the desktops. So while some of the same sort of things apply in terms of restricted screen space and the way you might get data to iPhone apps, they're not sort of presented in the same way that widgets are. As I've discussed, on the web as well, you've now got a standard for widgets. And Apache Wookie is a Java servlet program which is built for serving them over a web server by embedding them into a page. But other places where you might see things which work in a similar way to widgets, if you've ever used a content management system, something like Joomla or Drupal, or a virtual learning environment, a lot of them have these blocks down the side of the pages, and what happens inside those blocks is basically the same thing that happens in a widget. Also, you've got Google Gadgets, which provide an API for easily embedding widget-type functions in existing web pages. So some of the technologies they'll use on these various platforms, on phones, you've often got Java available, because a lot of push for putting Java on mobile technologies has been done in the past, well, decade or so. So particularly before smartphones, the platform that you had on all phones that you could rely on with Java. And similarly, Android is basically, all apps for that are basically written in Java. On the desktop, it's quite dependent on what you're writing on. Obviously, Apple will probably tend towards their sort of Objective-C and technologies like that. I don't know exactly, because I've not written anything for Dashboard. KDE can use web stuff, or they can use other shell scripts or little Python programs or anything like that, just stuck together. On the web, it's all about web standards, so HTML and JavaScript, HTML and CSS for presenting it, JavaScript for getting the data and doing all of the processing behind the scenes. And as I said, there's an increasing move on all the platforms to using web standards rather than using these disparate proprietary systems. That more phones are moving towards using W3C standard widgets, and on the desktop, in a lot of cases, you can use them as well. So this is just a little diagram to show you what's going on when you're using a widget. So in the middle here, you've got your web browser displaying a page with a widget in the middle, or on the side, or wherever you want it really, just as part of the page with perhaps other information, maybe the main content of the site here. So you've got a web server which is serving the page and serving the widget as well. So you've got some HTML, some CSS and some JavaScript being served and loaded up in the widget. You've then got to get some data and do some processing and display it, do something useful with the widget basically. Otherwise there's no difference to it just being part of the web page as it is. So some of the ways we can get data, you can have server-side scripts, so they could be Java server pages, PHP, ASP, anything else that you want running on the server. And you can load stuff in using a technology called AJAX, and that allows you to do what's called an asynchronous request for data, which means that rather than normally when you're going through a web page, each time you click on a link, the page has to go away, get a completely new page and reload it, and while that's going on, you can't interact with the page because it's reloading. Whereas with AJAX, it does it all in the background and only gets the bits of data which you're asking for. And while it's doing that, you can still interact with the page, you can still click other links and buttons and whatever. So it gives it a much more sort of desktop-like feel to it. And then from that server-side script, you'd get back some either a block of HTML, which you can then dump in the page, or some raw data, which you can then process and put in the page as you want to display it. Another good place to get data from is the user. A widget doesn't have to do everything programmatically. You can have an interface where a user can input stuff. For example, if you wanted a calculator for, say, if you want to calculate a subnet mask, you could have the JavaScript doing all the calculations, and the user just inputs, say, the amount of networks they want, the amount of hosts they want on each network, and then the JavaScript. It doesn't then have to do any of this calculation because you don't need to use the server-side scripts. You can do everything within the widget itself, so you don't need to waste any bandwidth with communication or anything like that. And it's also a lot quicker because it's all running locally. The third, well, in fact, as well as user input, you can also get input from the device they're running on. So if you've got other sensors on there, you might be able to get something useful out of them. Web services are another good place to get data. A web service is a web application, except for instead of displaying web pages like a normal web application does, it gives you back data. So they'll present an API, which is usually a URL, which you call, and then based on the URL, it'll give you some data which you can process. A few technologies that are used for that, sort of standards for creating web services are REST and SOAP, and there's a few others which aren't used as much, but basically they all just involve sending some data through an HTTP request and getting an HTTP request with the data you asked for back. So now we're going to start looking at how you actually go about creating a JavaScript widget, leading on to the work we're going to do in the lab. If you have any questions about anything I'm showing you, anything that looks alien to you, don't hesitate to put your hand up and ask, and I can explain it in a bit more detail. So to start off with any widget that's using web technologies, you need some HTML where your interface or your data is going to be displayed. Now in this example, I've created an entire HTML page with some JavaScript included and a container which is going to be where we output our stuff. So this is going to be, if you're using a W3C standard widget, this is how you do it. If you were doing a Palm application, this is probably how you do it as well. But if you were just doing, say, a block in a CMS, you'd probably only include this div here, the container.